What if I told you that the end of World War II was not the end of suffering for millions of Germans? While the world spoke of peace, for many, a completely new chapter began, filled with hunger, fear, and uncertainty. But why is this so rarely talked about? After 1945, Germany lay in ruins. But alongside reconstruction, there was another reality, one that often remains in the shadows: expulsion, hardship, and strict occupation policies. In this video, we take a closer look at what many people truly experienced during this time. Flight and expulsion. One of the most dramatic and often overlooked consequences of the war was the mass displacement of Germans from Eastern Europe. As borders shifted and territories were reassigned, millions of ethnic Germans living in places like East Prussia, Silesia, and Sudetenland were forced to leave. But this wasn't an organized relocation. It was chaos. Families were given little to no time to prepare. Many fled on foot, carrying only what they could hold. Elderly people struggled to keep up. Children walked for miles without understanding where they were going. There were no guarantees of safety, no clear destination, just movement, endless movement. The conditions were brutal: long treks through freezing temperatures, overcrowded trains with barely any food or water, disease spreading quickly among exhausted populations. And along the way, many didn't make it. Thousands died from hunger, exposure, or violence during these forced migrations. For those who survived, the trauma didn't end when they reached their destination. Because destination often meant refugee camps or overcrowded towns already struggling to support their own populations. They had lost everything. Not just their homes, but their identity, their roots, their sense of belonging. Life in the ruins. If you had walked through German cities in 1945, you wouldn't have recognized them. Entire urban centers had been flattened by bombing campaigns. Streets were buried under rubble. Buildings stood hollowed out, like empty shells. And yet, people still lived there. Survival meant adapting to destruction. Families moved into whatever structures were still standing: basements, partially collapsed houses, even abandoned factories. There was no proper infrastructure. No heating. No reliable water supply. Electricity was limited or non-existent. Food became one of the biggest daily struggles. The official rationing system existed, but it wasn't enough. People stood in long lines for basic supplies that often ran out before their turn came. Malnutrition became widespread. Black markets began to thrive, where anything, from bread to cigarettes, could be traded for survival. And then came the winter of 1946-47. One of the coldest winters in European history. Temperatures dropped drastically. Fuel was scarce. People burned furniture, books, anything they could find just to stay warm. Hunger and cold combined into a deadly force. Many who had survived the war didn't survive the peace. Occupation and control. After the war, Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, controlled by the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. Each zone operated differently, with its own policies and priorities. But for the average German citizen, one thing was constant: loss of control over their own country. Daily life was shaped by rules imposed from outside. Curfews were common. Travel between zones was restricted. Communication was monitored. Even small aspects of everyday life were regulated. For a population already dealing with loss and instability, this added another layer of uncertainty. Denazification programs were introduced to remove former Nazi influence from society. While necessary, these processes often created confusion and tension. People were investigated, questioned, and sometimes barred from working based on past affiliations. In many cases, the lines between guilt, survival, and coercion were not so clear. At the same time, rebuilding efforts slowly began. Infrastructure had to be restored, governments had to be restructured. But progress was uneven. Especially in the early years, daily life still felt like a waiting period, a pause between disaster and something unknown. Violence and trauma. Even after the war officially ended, violence did not simply disappear. In many regions, especially in the eastern zones, civilians faced acts of revenge, looting, and assault. The breakdown of order during the final months of the war had lasting consequences. Women were among the most affected. Large numbers experienced sexual violence during and after the occupation. These experiences left deep psychological scars, ones that were rarely spoken about at the time. Silence became a form of survival. Entire generations carried these memories without acknowledgement. Men returning from war faced their own trauma. Many came back physically injured or mentally broken by what they had experienced. But there was little space for healing. Society was focused on rebuilding, not reflecting. Emotional wounds were pushed aside, buried under the pressure to move forward. This created a culture of silence. Families didn't talk about what had happened. Children grew up sensing something was wrong, but never fully understanding it. The emotional consequences of this period didn't end in the 1940s. They continued for decades. Rebuilding. But at what cost? As the late 1940s approached, signs of recovery slowly began to appear. Especially in the Western zones, economic reforms and external aid, such as the Marshall Plan, helped stabilize the situation. Industries restarted. Jobs returned. Cities began to rise again from the rubble. This period would later be known as the Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle. But the word miracle can be misleading, because behind the visible progress, there were unresolved issues. Many people never returned to their original homes. Millions of displaced individuals had to integrate into completely new communities. Social tensions were common, resources were limited, and memories of loss were still fresh. In the Eastern Zone, under Soviet control, rebuilding followed a different path. Political systems changed. Economic structures shifted. And over time, this division would lead to the creation of two separate German states, East and West Germany, each with its own identity, ideology, and future. Why is this rarely discussed? This is perhaps the most complex question of all. Why isn't this chapter of history more widely discussed? The answer lies in context. Germany was responsible for immense suffering during World War II. The crimes of the Nazi regime were unprecedented, and rightly so. Much of post-war focus was placed on acknowledging, confronting, and learning from those atrocities. But in that process, the suffering of ordinary German civilians often remained in the background. Not because it didn't exist, but because it was overshadowed by a much larger narrative of responsibility and guilt. For decades, discussing German victimhood was seen as controversial. There was a fear that it might shift focus away from the crimes that had been committed. Only in more recent years has there been a more balanced approach, one that acknowledges both responsibility and the human cost experienced by civilians. Because history isn't simple. It isn't one-sided. It's layered, complex, and often uncomfortable. A silent legacy. What makes this period so powerful is not just what happened, but how long it remained unspoken. The ruins were rebuilt. The economy recovered. Germany transformed into one of the strongest nations in the world. But beneath that success, there were stories that took decades to surface. Stories of loss, of displacement, of survival against impossible odds. And when we look back at 1945, it becomes clear, the end of war is not the end of suffering. Sometimes, it's just the beginning of a different kind of struggle. One that doesn't make headlines. One that unfolds quietly, in the lives of ordinary people trying to rebuild what was lost. So the real question is, how should we remember this part of history? Not to rewrite the past. Not to change responsibility, but to understand the full picture. Because only then can we truly grasp what war does, not just during the conflict, but long after it ends. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. This period shows how deeply wars continue to affect people even after they end. What do you think about this? Should more attention be given to these chapters of history? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more historical insights.